My ex-girlfriend cheated and blamed me until karma sat her down in front of me. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy writing something like this on Reddit, but here I am because maybe someone out there needs to hear this, or maybe I just need to finally say it out loud without being interrupted or blamed or gaslit. So here goes. I'm a 27-year-old guy from the US, and for the longest time, I thought I had found my person, the kind of relationship people point to and say, that's real. And it didn't start dramatically or romantically like in movies. It started quietly, naturally, the way the best things often do. When I met her at a friend's birthday get-together where neither of us even wanted to be there. We bonded over how awkward the whole thing felt, laughed in the corner like outsiders, exchanged numbers without thinking much of it, and somehow that turned into late-night texts, then phone calls, then seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week, then suddenly realizing weeks had passed where she was the first person I wanted to talk to in the morning and the last one at night, and back then it felt easy, effortless, like we were building something solid, brick by brick, not rushing, not forcing it, just letting it grow. She told me things about her childhood. She said she'd never told anyone. I told her about my insecurities, my fear of not being enough, my pressure to succeed, and she looked at me like those things didn't make me weaker, but more human. And I fell for that look more than anything else. We moved in together after a year. Not because of pressure, but because it made sense. Split rent, shared groceries, lazy Sundays, inside jokes, plans for the future that felt exciting but not unrealistic. And when people talk about love languages, mine was always showing up. Consistency. Being there even when things weren't glamorous. And I thought she understood that, or at least appreciated it. But looking back now, with clarity I didn't have then, there were small things I brushed off because love makes you generous with excuses. Like how she started guarding her phone a little too carefully, how she'd get irritated when I asked about her day instead of opening up, how compliments turned into criticisms disguised as concerns, how she'd say things like, "You've changed," without being able to explain how suddenly my work hours were a problem when before she said she admired my drive, how she stopped initiating affection but still expected it from me, how conversations that used to feel warm started feeling transactional, and every time I sensed something was off, I convinced myself I was overthinking, because that's what she'd say. You're reading too much into it. Why are you being so insecure? Not everything is about you. And I didn't want to be the controlling boyfriend or the paranoid one, so I swallowed the discomfort and doubled down on being better, more attentive, more patient, more understanding, while she slowly checked out emotionally, piece by piece, like someone leaving a room without making noise. And I didn't realize how alone I was becoming in my own relationship until the night everything shattered. A night that still plays in my head in fragments, because it didn't happen with a dramatic reveal or a confession. It happened with a mistake on her part, one she probably never thought would matter, when she left her laptop open on the couch while she showered. A message popping up that wasn't meant for me. A name I didn't recognize, followed by words that didn't belong to a coworker or a friend. Words that carried intimacy, familiarity, hunger, and I remember staring at the screen, feeling like the room tilted, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, my hands shaking as I scrolled even though part of me was screaming to stop. Because once you know, you can't unknow. And there it was, weeks, maybe months of conversations, flirting, complaints about me, jokes at my expense, plans that weren't supposed to include me. And when she came out of the shower and saw my face, saw the laptop, saw the truth, the first thing she did wasn't cry or apologize. It was deny. She laughed nervously and said it wasn't what it looked like, that I was misunderstanding the context, that it was just harmless flirting, that everyone does it, that it didn't mean anything. And when that didn't work, when I asked questions she couldn't answer, when my voice cracked and I asked how long, the denial turned into justification. She said she'd been lonely. She said she felt neglected. She said I wasn't emotionally present, that I was too focused on work, that she needed attention and I wasn't giving it to her. And then came the part that hurt more than the cheating itself. The blame, when she looked me in the eyes and said, "You pushed me into it." Like her choices were reactions. Like my flaws were responsible for her betrayal. Like fidelity was conditional and I'd failed the test. And in that moment, I felt something inside me collapse. Because not only had I lost her, I lost the version of myself who believed love meant safety. And the aftermath was quiet but brutal, because she didn't beg me to stay or fight for us. She told a story, a carefully edited version of events that painted her as someone who tried and tried until she couldn't anymore. And I watched mutual friends drift away without confrontation, without questions, just distance, shorter replies, canceled plans, assumptions, hanging in the air. And I didn't have the energy to defend myself. because I was too busy replaying everything, wondering where I went wrong, wondering if I really wasn't enough, wondering how someone could share a bed with you, plan a future with you, and still make you feel like you were the reason they betrayed you. And the chapter of my life ended not with closure or answers, but with me sitting alone in an apartment that no longer felt like home, surrounded by silence, staring at my reflection in the dark window, asking myself over and over what I lacked, what I missed, and what loving deeply had made me foolish instead of strong. After the breakup, life didn't explode all at once. It collapsed slowly, quietly, in ways that felt almost cruel because there was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where everything went wrong. It was more like waking up every day a little heavier than the last, realizing piece by piece that I wasn't just heartbroken, I was being erased from the life I thought I had, because while I was still replaying our last conversation in my head, still wondering how someone could flip a switch from love to blame so easily, she had already started telling her version of the story, and I didn't hear it directly at first. I felt it through absence, through the way group chats went silent when I replied, through how invitations stopped coming, through how friends who used to show up at our place unannounced suddenly got busy. And at first I thought I was imagining it, that maybe everyone just needed time. But then I ran into a mutual friend at a grocery store, someone I'd known for years, and the conversation felt stiff, rehearsed, like they were talking to someone they didn't fully trust anymore. And later that night, I got a text from another friend asking, "Hey man, are you doing okay? I heard things were really bad between you two." And when I asked what they meant, the reply took forever to come, and when it did, it was vague, careful. I don't want to get involved, but she said she felt really neglected and emotionally abandoned. And that's when it hit me that she hadn't just cheated and walked away. She had framed herself as the wounded one, the girl who tried everything until she couldn't anymore. And in that story, I wasn't a guy who got betrayed. I was the reason she strayed, the emotionally distant boyfriend who forced her hand. And the worst part was how believable it sounded on the surface, because I had been busy. I had been tired. I had been focused on building a career, and people love simple explanations, especially when they don't require uncomfortable questions. So slowly, quietly, I became the problem everyone sympathized around, not with, and I didn't fight it because I didn't have the strength. I barely had the energy to get through the day, let alone defend my character, and as my social circle shrank, my world got smaller, lonelier, darker. The apartment felt too quiet without her, but also suffocating, because everything reminded me of what I lost. The couch where we used to watch shows, the kitchen where we cooked together, even the stupid little things, like the coffee mugs we bought on a weekend trip. And financially, things started slipping too, because heartbreak doesn't care about rent deadlines or credit card bills. I missed days at work, my performance dipped, and eventually, so did my income. And there's a special kind of shame that comes with struggling quietly while the person who hurt you appears to be thriving. Because every time I opened social media, which I should have stopped doing but didn't, I saw her smiling in places we talked about going together, posting pictures with new friends, tagging a new guy whose arm was always casually around her waist, captions about healing, self-love, and finally choosing happiness. And I would stare at my cracked phone screen sitting on the edge of my bed, wondering how the same story could have two completely different realities. How she could look so at peace while I was fighting to breathe some mornings. And I started internalizing everything she said, replaying her words until they felt like facts. Maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe I wasn't emotionally available. Maybe my focus on work made me unlovable. Maybe if I'd just been better, more attentive, more exciting, she wouldn't have cheated. And those thoughts eat at you. They hollow you out because they turn pain into identity, and before I knew it, my confidence was gone. My self-respect felt borrowed, fragile, like it could shatter if someone looked at me the wrong way. I stopped going out, stopped answering calls, stopped trusting my own instincts, because every time I tried to make sense of what happened, I hit the same wall of confusion and guilt. And depression isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just waking up and feeling like there's no point. Sometimes it's sitting in the dark scrolling through old photos even though you know it's hurting you. Sometimes it's convincing yourself that everyone would be better off without your presence. And there were nights I sat on the floor of that apartment with my back against the wall, staring at nothing, feeling like my life had split into a before and an after, and the after version was someone I didn't recognize or respect. And yet, even at my lowest, there was this quiet exhaustion that eventually turned into something else. Not motivation, not hope, just fatigue from chasing answers I was never going to get, because no explanation from her would ever undo what she did or how she twisted it. And one night, after another pointless spiral of rereading old messages and checking her profile like I was punishing myself, I caught my reflection in the black screen of my phone and realized how empty I looked, how tired, how small I had made myself trying to understand someone who had already moved on. And something shifted. Not dramatically, not like a movie moment, but enough for me to stop. Enough to put the phone down, enough to think, what if I never get closure from her? And that thought scared me at first, but then it felt oddly freeing because chasing explanations had kept me stuck, had kept her relevant in my life even after she was gone. And I didn't suddenly become confident or happy after that. I didn't wake up the next day a new man, but I started doing small, almost invisible things for myself. I focused on getting through work one day at a time. I cooked simple meals instead of skipping them. I went on walks just to get out of the apartment. I stopped checking her profiles even though the urge was still there, and those changes didn't fix my life overnight, but they created a crack in the darkness, a small space where self-respect could start growing again, quietly, without announcements, without revenge fantasies, just a slow, painful realization that even if she never took responsibility, even if friends never apologized for believing her version, I still had a choice about what kind of person I became after being broken. And that was the first time since the breakup that I felt something other than loss. It wasn't hope yet, but it was the absence of self-hatred. And for me, at rock bottom, that was everything. Somewhere along the line, without me even realizing it at first, my life stopped being about surviving the damage she caused and started becoming about building something that belonged to me. Because once I stopped chasing explanations and validation from people who had already decided who I was based on a half-told story, I had more mental space than I'd had in months, and I poured that space into work at first, not out of passion, but out of necessity. Because when everything else feels unstable, routine becomes a lifeline, and I showed up every day even when I didn't feel like myself, even when my confidence was still shaky. And slowly that consistency started paying off in ways I didn't expect. My boss noticed, responsibilities increased, opportunities opened up. And then, one random Tuesday that didn't feel special at all, I got offered a role I'd quietly wanted for years. Better pay, more autonomy, a chance to actually grow instead of just survive. And I remember sitting in my car afterward with my hands on the steering wheel just breathing. Not because I was excited, but because I was relieved. Relieved that something in my life was finally moving forward instead of falling apart. And with that financial stability came a subtle shift in how I carried myself. Not a flashy transformation, not a dramatic montage, just the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can pay your bills, plan your future, and not panic every time an unexpected expense pops up. And once money stopped being a constant source of stress, I had room to take care of myself in ways I'd neglected for too long. I started going to the gym again, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it cleared my head, because it reminded me that my body could still feel strong, capable, present. I slept better, ate better, spent less time spiraling and more time being intentional. And what surprised me most was how my mindset changed alongside my routine. I stopped replaying arguments that no longer mattered, stopped wondering what I could have done differently to keep someone who didn't respect me, and started trusting my own perspective again. Trusting that loyalty and consistency weren't flaws just because the wrong person took them for granted, and that confidence didn't make me loud or arrogant. It made me calm, grounded, harder to shake, and people noticed. Not in a wow you've changed way, but in how conversations felt easier, how eye contact lingered longer, how I wasn't shrinking myself anymore to avoid conflict or rejection. And ironically, that was around the same time cracks started showing in her life. Not because I was looking for them, but because they reached me anyway, through mutual acquaintances who'd gone quiet after the breakup and now suddenly wanted to catch up. Through offhand comments that slipped into conversations, through stories that didn't line up with the perfect image she still tried to project online. And I learned that her new relationship, the one she seemed so happy in at first, wasn't the fairy tale she advertised. That the guy she'd left me for wasn't as attentive or patient as she claimed. That arguments were frequent, that trust issues ran deep. And hearing that didn't make me feel triumphant the way I once imagined it might. It made me feel oddly detached, like listening to news about a place I used to live but no longer belonged to, because by then my focus had shifted inward, toward building a life that felt stable and honest. And as my confidence grew, people's perception of me started changing too. Not overnight, but gradually. Friends who had distanced themselves began reaching out with casual messages. Hey man, how have you been? Long time no talk. And I could tell some of them felt awkward, unsure, like they were testing the water, and I didn't confront them or demand apologies. I just showed up as myself, calm, kind, unchanged in the ways that mattered, and slowly the narrative around me softened. Questions replaced assumptions, empathy replaced judgment, and I realized that time had done what arguments never could. It had revealed patterns, shown who was consistent, and who wasn't. And eventually, inevitably, she heard about me too. About the promotion, the stability, the fact that I wasn't the broken guy she'd left behind, and curiosity crept in where certainty used to be. Because success has a way of disrupting old stories, especially the ones built on blame. And I didn't know it then, but that curiosity was the beginning of a reckoning she couldn't avoid. Not because I wanted it, not because I planned it, but because life has a strange way of bringing truth to the surface when you least expect it. And by the time she realized how much control she'd lost over the narrative, I had already reclaimed something far more valuable than reputation or revenge. I had reclaimed myself. I didn't expect to see her again, not because I thought life was neatly wrapped up or that karma worked on a schedule, but because I had finally reached a place where she no longer occupied space in my daily thoughts. And when you genuinely move on, the idea of running into someone who once defined your pain feels distant, almost abstract. So when it happened, it wasn't dramatic or cinematic, it was painfully ordinary. The kind of moment that sneaks up on you without warning. I was sitting alone at a quiet cafe near my office one evening after a long day, laptop open but untouched, just decompressing, when I heard my name spoken in a familiar voice that instantly tightened something in my chest, and I looked up to see her standing there, frozen mid-step, eyes wide in that split-second recognition that carried years of shared history, regret, and unspoken words. And for a brief moment, neither of us said anything, because reality takes time to settle when it contradicts the version you've rehearsed in your head. And she looked different. Not in a bad way, just worn. Like someone who had been carrying a story longer than they expected. And she asked if she could sit. Tentative, careful, like she wasn't sure which version of me she'd get. And I surprised myself by nodding calmly, because I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't eager either. I was just present. And she started talking almost immediately, filling the silence with explanations she'd clearly practiced, telling me she'd been thinking about me lately, that she'd heard I was doing well, that life hadn't turned out the way she expected, and at first she tried to keep it light, nostalgic even, mentioning old jokes, shared memories, but when I didn't mirror the energy, when I listened without leaning in, something shifted, and the justifications came out, softer than before, but still familiar. She talked about how confused she'd been back then, how she felt lost, how she didn't know how to communicate what she needed, how she never meant to hurt me, and I noticed how she kept glancing at me as if waiting for reassurance, for forgiveness, for me to fill the gaps she left in her story, and that's when it hit her, I think. Not all at once, but gradually, in the way I sat comfortably in my own skin, in the way my voice didn't shake, in the way I didn't rush to fix her discomfort, because the man across from her wasn't broken anymore, wasn't desperate for clarity or validation, wasn't trying to prove anything, and I could see realization flicker behind her eyes as she understood that the power dynamic she remembered no longer existed, that the version of me who internalized blame and begged for understanding had been replaced by someone who had learned to live without her approval, and she faltered, admitted that things hadn't worked out with the guy she left me for, that trust issues followed them, that she felt restless and unsatisfied, and there was a moment where she looked at me with something close to grief, like she was finally seeing the cost of her choices clearly. Not because I spelled it out for her, but because my presence alone did. And I didn't interrupt or correct her or list the ways she hurt me. I didn't need to, because truth doesn't require volume. And when she finally asked the question I knew was coming, whether I ever thought about us, whether there was a chance to reconnect, I answered honestly and gently. I told her that I had loved her deeply once, that the relationship mattered to me, but that love without respect had broken something I couldn't rebuild, that I'd spent a long time healing, not from losing her, but from losing myself, and that I wasn't willing to return to a place where my worth was negotiable. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Final, because she understood then that this wasn't a conversation about getting back together, it was a reckoning. Not one fueled by anger or revenge, but by clarity. And for the first time, since the night everything fell apart, I felt a sense of closure settle in my chest. Not because she apologized, though she tried, quietly, imperfectly, but because I no longer needed her understanding to validate my experience. And as we stood to leave, she hesitated, looked like she wanted to say more, but some things don't need additional words, and we parted with a simple goodbye. No promises, no lingering glances, just acceptance. And as I walked out into the evening air, I realized karma hadn't yelled or humiliated or punished her publicly. It had simply placed her in front of the man she once underestimated, the man she blamed and left behind, and made her see that he had survived, grown, and moved on without bitterness. And that moment wasn't about her regret or her loss. It was about my peace, The quiet dignity of knowing I didn't need to prove anything anymore, that my life was no longer a reaction to her choices, and that loving deeply had never been my flaw. It had been my strength all along. The end. Alright, let me talk to you as Adam Cole, because this story deserves more than a casual reaction. What makes this story hit so hard isn't the cheating itself. We've all heard stories like that. It's the quiet injustice. The way the MC didn't just lose a relationship, but lost his reputation, his support system, and for a while, his sense of self. That's real life. Cheating doesn't end with a breakup, it poisons the narrative afterwards. And watching him get blamed, isolated, and slowly crushed while she curated a healing persona online, that's painfully accurate. But what elevates his story is restraint. There's no cheap revenge arc, no screaming match, no viral humiliation. The power shift happens internally. The MC doesn't win by destroying her. He wins by outgrowing the version of himself that needed her validation. That cafe scene in the final chapter, that's karma done right. Not loud, not flashy, just devastatingly honest. And here's the part that really stuck with me. When he says closure wasn't for her, it was for him. That's the lesson most people miss. You don't heal by being understood by the person who hurt you. You heal when you no longer need them to understand. This story isn't about proving she was wrong. It's about proving he was never broken to begin with. So, if you've ever been blamed for someone else's betrayal, if you've ever watched your name get dragged while you stayed silent, this one's going to sit with you for a while. If this story resonated with you, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Reddiculous. Stories like this don't just entertain, they remind you of your worth. And trust me, you don't want to miss the next one.